Hello and welcome everyone to a webinar as part of the EU Values Network webinar series. I'm Emily Jones, your host and moderator, and I'm pleased to introduce our distinguished speakers today, who will guide us through today's timely discussion on governance, anti-corruption and economic policy. Today, we're honoured to welcome Professor Alina Mungiu-Pippidi, a leading voice in political science and governance. Alina is a professor of comparative public policy at the Luis Guido Carli University in Rome, and she directs the European Research Centre for Anti-Corruption and State Building. Her significant contributions to advancing good governance have earned her international recognition, including appointments as an expert to various EU institutions. This year, she was awarded the prestigious Leo Mechelin Medal from the University of Helsinki's Rule of Law Centre for her impactful work in promoting the rule of law. And today we'll have the chance to hear her discuss her latest book, Rethinking Corruption, published by Edward Elgar in 2023, which explores new perspectives on tackling corruption and strengthening governance globally. And joining Professor Mungiu-Pippidi is our expert discussant, Professor Brigitte Unger, who has served as the chair of public sector economics at Utrecht University since 2002. With extensive experience in economic policy, tax competition, and money laundering, Brigitte Unger has consulted for the Dutch Ministry of Finance, the UNODC, EU, Eurostat, to name just some. Her leadership in the Combating Fiscal Fraud and Empowering Regulators Coffers project has made critical strides in tracking the tax gap and innovating regulatory practice. So we're very happy to have you both here today and to have you all here with us actually to delve into some of these crucial issues.
Hello, everybody.
So, hello there.
Hi. Thank you for inviting us.
Of course. Thank you for being here. And well, by now you'll be familiar with the EU Values Network, but if you'd like to learn more about our mission to create dialogue on the EU's core normative values, I really encourage everyone to visit our website. There you'll find an array of resources, including past webinars, blogs, podcasts, etc., all that explore the topics central to the EU's influence and values. And we've recently published our quarterly newsletter, which provides a kind of comprehensive overview to all our latest activities, along with a curated reading list that we think you'll enjoy. So yeah, do sign up to our mailing list and give us a like and a follow on social media, please, and let us know what you think of this session today. And so, well, without further ado, on behalf of the EU Values Network, I'd like to thank Alina, Brigitte, and everyone at home today for joining us. It is my great pleasure to hand the floor over to you, Alina. If you're happy to share your screen, and go from there.
Yes, thank you very much, Emily. So I'm a bit frustrated because, like everybody teaching online since 2020 rather frequently, that is a format in which I do not see who is with us. It's only you who see who is with us, but I don't see anyone. But yes, okay, now I discovered what I should probably do. So why Rethinking Corruption? That's probably the first question related to this book of mine, which appeared in 2023. Disclaimer to start with. First, if you have read me before in the past 15 years, it's not going to be so entirely new to you. It's more like conclusions at the end of an interval of time where new ideas and new paradigms were tried, tested, and promoted, actually. And second, the title is not at all of my doing. It is a series of Edward Elgar, an academic publisher who publishes a lot of rethinks in various areas. And of course, one day, the turn came of rethinking corruption. And then they turned to me, and it's been on my back burner for 2 years prior to 2023 until I decided that I will do one more book on corruption. Now, if you read me before, you know that in fact my chief monogram of corruption is Quest for Good Governance: How Societies Build Control of Corruption from 2015 with the Cambridge University Press. And to this, I have added another monograph, which is in full about corruption promoted across borders. So in other words, external intervention, Western external intervention. In my case, it was mostly EU, European Union efforts to promote corruption across borders. And this is my 2019 book, Europe's Burden, Promoting Good Governance Across Borders. But what did I put into the Rethinking Corruption, which therefore is the most recent of it? And I'm tempted to say, hopefully, my last book on corruption, and I move to something else in the future. What I try to put into this is a little bit of lessons learned and analytic module to help people learn things for which now there is more than enough evidence. Of course, one has to understand a little bit that when I started when I really started to have an audience, so to speak, which was with the Norwegian Agency for Development and Cooperation Commission in 2010. And then what I said for the first time seemed very scandalous. But then on some grounds, people were prepared to hear it because they already knew anti-corruption is not working. But anyway, the reasons why anti-corruption was not working, as I explained them at the time, roughly for the first time pushing to very, very apolitical donors, the idea that corruption is a political phenomenon. There is no way in which we can succeed against corruption in this technocratic manner, which tries not to upset anyone. And at the time, I sort of said, anti-corruption is not win-win. If anything, some people will really have to cry their eyes out. Some people will have to lose their yachts. Some people will have to lose their rents. That is what anti-corruption is. And here we are basically, 15 years later, and it does not seem that these lessons reached home in the practice, in the big industry of anti-corruption. So I continue to get year after year very kind invitations from big donors who ask me to train their people, their program designers, their program operators. And time again, we seem to be back to square one. And of course, there is an academic explanation for all this. Of course, one explanation is that I was not loud enough, and people who think like me, we didn't build a sufficient front and we didn't work enough to drive these messages home. But I really do not think this is it, because quite good people whom I know learned these lessons and promoted these lessons, and this is simply ignoring the bulk of people who are in their countries and who didn't need us to tell them these things because they knew them already. They had really insight into how it's going on in those countries and why Western donor anti-corruption industry doesn't work. But the reason of this, it's more simply that something exists which is called the Samaritan dilemma. And it was coined in relation to international aid by someone whom I greatly admire, an economist called Elinor Ostrom, in a project for one of my favorite aid agencies, the Swedish agency SIDA. And of course, we have a Samaritan dilemma in anti-corruption as well, which means that there is a system of incentives out there, which makes it that it is not in the best interest of states, it is not in the best interest of international donors, and definitely it's not in the best interest of most international consultants in anti-corruption, which have by now assisted in over 100 countries without one country getting better, to take these lessons on board. And I wrote Rethinking Corruption simply that nobody has the excuse of not putting something very simple, elementary phrased into one book for people to understand what conceptual errors are routinely made, making anti-corruption very, very ineffective. The second title, therefore, of this book could have been actually After Illusions, because 15 years ago, I was still a very successful person who had organized what was at the time the most successful anti-corruption campaign on the planet, right? The Romanian Coalition for a Clean Parliament in 2004, which was scaled up in Ukraine and about 8-9 other countries by Open Society Institute. And also, we were in full swing of the remarkably equally successful later Lava Jato Brazilian and corruption crackdown, on which we had seminars at Harvard where we thought that we turned the page and we congratulated one another. But now, as it turns out, it is still us academics in Europe and at Harvard who consider Lava Jato a success, and Brazilians, or most Brazilians, do not. So the second title of Rethinking Corruption, it's a bit of After Illusions. And of course, the important element which happened in the time is that corruption became, a core issue of in the global strategic new world. So corruption basically was weaponized, and anti-corruption was weaponized as well. And we are now looking in a world where corruption has become a major security issue, and therefore we are asked to make more clear distinctions between national corruption and cross-border corruption. Professor Unger might have something interesting to say about this. Okay, however, what happened in these 15 years is that we built some tools, and compared to the times when we only have insight, these tools have managed to mobilize a bulk of evidence, what I would really call evidence. And they can be found on Corruption Rescore, which I hope everybody discovered and uses, on Europam EU, and on opentender.eu, and Europam EU, and partly the others as well, because we are building something new and comprehensive just for the European universe, which is Europe and the accession countries and its neighbors, is going to move into this new webpage, which is called Corruption Data EU, related to our new project. Now, what does the book do? I mean, what are the really elementary things that I've been trying to do in this book to sum up this decade of what I would call evidence amassing, because that was what we've been trying to. Is, you know, everybody could argue whatever related to corruption because there was no data. We are all operating on perception data. And all along, I argued that fact data can exist and can be gathered because I had fact data in Romania. I had very good data. Eastern Europe, it's really transparent. So in all our countries, not just Romania, we were able to have public procurement data, public expenditure data, and to document political connections, because very early on, in fact, as part of, as main follow-up of my 2004 campaign, we made politicians adopt a very extensive financial and conflict of interest disclosure form. So Romania was probably the first country in the world where, using an algorithm, an institution that we created in 2007, I think, Romanian National Integrity Agency, was able, using an algorithm, to check for the political connection between, for instance, public contracts, winners, and elected and appointed officials. And once you have managed to become so automatic, you can really say that, you know, it's done. I mean, of course, you can extend this to other areas, but we are in the European Union. So public contract is an important area because public-private partnerships are also regulated by public procurement laws or similar laws, and we don't have subsidies. So all the big rents that you can find in other countries, with a bit of digitalization, in ours, you can really trace them down. Okay, so what the book does is that it introduces a distinction between de jure, the arsenal of anti-corruption instrument created in these 15 years, and which is very impressive on EU side as well as on the rest of the world. And definitely this evolved, definitely this grew and grew. So there is, you know, no argument that this is not one thing which has been going up. The de jure equipment, the international anti-corruption normative framework. But of course, my argument is that we should always beware that between the legal country or the legal world and the real world, there can be a gap, and we should have the tools to measure this gap and account for it. Then what the other book the other thing the book does is that it defines corruption in distinct frames as thin, as is the case with legal corruption, and as thick, as people seem to understand it nowadays, as basically the implementation of public policy of the principle of ethical universalism, where everybody is treated fairly and equally, and people vote for populists because they really perceive that this is infringed all the time. And as two different contexts, corruption as exception and corruption as norm. And of course, the world is not divided into these two ideal types. But what the book does is that it offers a simplified instrument of diagnosis instrument, which comes prior to measurement. So before measuring, you have to know a little bit what context are you in. And for this, I offer a number of models. Okay, then of course I'm interested in international intervention, and on the basis of all this, I introduce in a book format for the first time, because it's online already, this new generation of actionable indicators. Now, very fast, I'm just going to show to you a little bit how our indicators look like and how they operate, to understand both where I'm coming from and what I hope now to do to do a little bit, to update and do a little bit better, more comprehensively for the European Union. Here is what you see as like the first thing in which we documented the intervention between de jure and de facto. And what you see are two countries compared. The two countries happen to be Finland, who is on top of the world at good governance, also on top of the world at judicial independence, and Hungary, which is in fact, as you very well know, a backslider. And according to the Rus Corruption Perception Index, Hungary is now the country in the world which is the most corrupt in the European Union, actually. Okay, and if you look at how this website is organized and documented by us, you see that this is a website of regulation, of public accountability regulation. And you can see the country compared with the European average. And in the European average, you can see it in blue and the country in red. And you can notice this fundamental difference between Finland and Hungary at these 6 areas fundamental for prevention of corruption, which are political funding, financial disclosures for officials, conflict of interest, freedom of information, and public procurement, which is that Hungary is doing better than the European average. On nearly every count, Hungary has more regulation on basically everything, perhaps freedom of information, not so much, while Finland is the opposite. Finland is inferior in terms of regulation of good governance and accountability regulation to the EU average on everything except freedom of information. On freedom of information and transparency, freedom, of course, is on top of the world because they are the only country in the world which publishes 1 day per year everybody's income and how much tax people paid, which, of course, it's an important deterrent of corruption. Now, this thing, for the first time, allowed us, the fact that we were able to quantify regulation, allowed us to introduce a new generation of research which could map this difference between de jure and de facto, which could first see that it exists, and then could try to study enabling context. I mean, why is Hungary not held by all this regulation? Why does Hungary have worse outcomes than Finland, despite the fact that it has such good preventive regulation, right? And that is, you know, like number one thing that we opened, and which is still complicated to digest for the international community, because the international community largely does one thing. It advocates for regulation to be adopted. When I lived for 15 years in Germany, and what people used to tell me, you know, in relation to Africa or other places where we work about, are saying, well, you know, okay, maybe regulation in itself doesn't change anything, but at least it's better to have good regulation than to have bad regulation. You know, and I didn't know how to tell them that that's actually not better, because people become very cynical if you adopt all the rules in the book and nothing changes. In fact, what you do is only contribute to informality and to a culture in which people do not respect the law anymore. Okay. Furthermore, what I argue in the book is that the enabling contexts very much depend to the context in which you operate. And of course, I have very, common criticisms to this that people heard for a number of times, but I still explain them as I explained them for the first time. For instance, I have to explain to people that whistleblower protection regulation, which I had seen for years adopted in Eastern Europe and never, making a difference in any country. In fact, people didn't even use it. If you ask people, if you travel to Albania and ask Albanians, who is the Edward Snowden of Albania? I mean, they've had a whistleblower protection regulation for years. Nobody will be able to give you the name of any famous whistleblowers, because despite having regulation, for some countries is despite having very good regulation, the regulation is not implemented. And this is basically due to the fact that whistleblower protection regulation is just a part of a broader context, let's say freedom of expression, in a society where you can have corruption as norm or corruption as an exception. Now, if the corruption is norm, for instance, in Albania, then it means that everybody plays by those rules of the game. People are afraid to dissent. And the reason there are no whistleblowers is that it's a very high cost on whistleblowers simply to do not what their colleagues do differently, but what everyone else does. You know, this is how Romania was before 2004. So I understand this very well. You know, I have an unfair advantage because I lived in a society like this. So if a country doesn't have freedom of the press, if people don't have the courage to speak out in this country, if the country is in fact based largely on clientelism, so it's not just one Putin who is corrupt, but you know, strata and strata, important networks in society. Basically, the society is organized into patronage group, into clients and networks and the rest. Then the whistleblower thing, it's not going to be any silver bullet, and you have to understand this. So the two contexts that I cross here are, one is of corruption as being the norm, the way things go on. For instance, from every public contracts, a kickbait is paid because they're all given by favoritism, and public procurement is the #1 source of funding of electoral campaigns. Versus corruption is exception. So yes, corruption exists, but this country is fairly well evolved, has a good public-private separation, a conflict of interest rules exist, they're enforced, and therefore politicians, the rulers, are no longer the corruption drivers. They can be occasionally corrupt. And corruption drivers are just, you know, the business people who seek privilege, like in developed societies where we study lobby. Now, this is lobby, and that's the difference between these societies and the other ones. And this is what is called in the work of Michael Johnson, the market influence set of countries, the very advanced countries where the bureaucracy is already autonomous from politicians, while in the other countries it's not, right? Where corruption is norm, neither the judiciary nor bureaucracy nor law enforcement are different. They are endogenous to the problem of corruption. They are all subordinated to the rulers. And therefore, the example that I give here is with anti-corruption agencies and police is that if you have corruption norm, first, if you have corruption norm, it's very difficult to fight it by judicial means. You will need reforms to create more and more, presuming reformers come to government, right? You will need reforms enlarging the circle of people who will win out of a change in this society. Because in any moment, if you have 51% people who are actually doing better being corrupt or being part of corrupt networks, there is no chance that any anti-corruption strategy will work. So if you have a corruption norm, you have two situations. You have the situation in which, let's say, by revolution, a government comes to power. I have seen this happening a few times in my life. In Estonia, in Georgia, in Armenia recently 4 or 5 years ago. So this can happen, right? And in this state of Mexico called Monterrey, where due to fights over the drug cartel, they managed to get rid of the corrupt governor and elect a governor who was in favor of reforms. All right, so if you have this revolutionary situation, the government has changed and the corruption norm, then you do not use the law enforcement to change, to fight corruption. What you have to do is to replace the law enforcement entirely. And this is the vetting situation that we had in Estonia, where they replaced the entire judiciary at the beginning of the 90s, with the consequence that for 6 months, no lawsuits, not even divorces, could have been judged. They simply set aside, worked in this judiciary in the Soviet times and created a new category. They brought back young people from retirement who had been active before the Soviet Union, and very young people from the banks of the school, and they, you know, trained everybody, and they opened like a totally different judiciary. In Monterrey, equally radical situation with the police reform. The private sector pulled human resource offices, and on their money, basically, they assessed and vetted the entire drug-infiltrated police. They eliminated most of it, and they recruited and trained a totally new police force, because there was no other way. The police was actually working for the drug cartel. In Georgia, President Saakashvili also famously vetted and replaced practically the entire police. He did this on a mix of national money and donor money, which is rather extraordinary, but it worked. It worked. I mean, out of the sudden, people no longer had to budget when traveling from Tbilisi to Yerevan, $100 to pay the police on the road, which was just like a universal tax, which had to go to the police. And of course, the Romanian example in which you can have, an anti-corruption agency with police directly subordinated. But I only know two good agencies which have performed in the past 15 years. One is in Indonesia, it's the CNAB, the other one is in Romania, and they had their moments. The Romanian one was empowered by the European accession, and they had their moments, and their moments are gone. Because once you have all concentrated in one point, anti-corruption became politicized, and the battle for that one point becomes really very serious. Okay, that's the second situation, of course, is government wants status quo, and therefore, you cannot use police in anti-corruption, you cannot use judges. In fact, it's very risky to have this, because what you will have is selective enforcement. Okay, this will be the Senegal, in which your anti-corruption agency goes directly and arrests the opponent of the president. All right, and in the corruption exception situation, you can also have a government which wants change, and a government which wants status quo, and there will be a difference between these approaches. Now, the picture that I use for these two contexts to make myself clearly understood is that when corruption is exception, the market influence situation that I just caused, you can definitely use these principal agent tools from the textbooks. In other words, the broom. You can use the broom because you have a little bit of dirt, okay? So you can use all kind of public management tools. They will work because the norm is with you and it's self-reinforcing. However, when context B looks a bit like the beach below, then of course you will have to come with a totally different thing. You cannot come with just one environment inspector to take every bottle on this beach, every pet on this beach, and analyze, take fingerprints, analyze who put it there and the rest, right? Because obviously everybody has been contributing to this. Okay, so my argument is that we have a Samaritan dilemma. Although these things are fairly obvious, we nevertheless go to dictatorships without any freedom of the press and tell them to adopt whistleblower protection regulation, or we go to countries which don't have fiscalized economies at all, like Peru, and we tell them to do, all kind of financial disclosures and things when we don't know where most money is. 90% of the money doesn't exist. 70% of people are in informal employment. Okay, so the whole country has first to be brought to light if we want to have any tools working in this country. And that means that you have to have a preliminary period in anti-corruption in which you actually work for formalization, and formalization is not done by repressive means. There are probably among you economists who know better that that's not the way to go to formalize an economy. You have to create incentives. You cannot just put people in jail when 70% of them actually work in unemployment. So, in other words, you cannot use the judiciary in many, many corruption situations, including this Moldova, Ukraine, countries which are EU accession. So what I say matters very much for us in Europe, not just for more poorer countries in Africa. When the judiciary is a problem, you cannot make it part of the solution. Something cannot be simultaneously both problem and solution. Of course, we have to reform the judiciary, but judiciaries are difficult to reform. Of course, we do not have all of us. I mean, nobody has these extraordinary people in Estonia who have done. They so happen to be former dissidents, people of, extraordinary public integrity, and we really don't have people like this these days in any countries. People who objectively will build a system will not help them and their friends to get reelected, but will help everyone else, will help ethical universalism. So what we have done is very unrealistic, and some of these tools will continue to be promoted because they are in United Nations Convention Against Corruption, like anti-corruption agencies. And of course, the whole discussion about regulation, where my books try to introduce a bit of order, trying to understand that most corruption is government failure. So presuming that most corruption is going to be solved by introducing more regulation is just wrong. Actually, what we have to do is to remove regulation, and in particular regulation which creates rents, which creates privileges. First thing to do in a corrupt country is to look at the number of monopolies which exist in that country, which exist in absolutely every sector. Greece had a fabulous list created by the European Commission of simply forbidding access to every profession by people who were already there and had closed the door to their entrance. I mean, for instance, you could not transport people in your cars in Greece and things like that. Okay, so the next thing that I offer is a model to understand a little bit every country and to be able to have some sort of actionable measurement. Because of course, the kind of measurement that we want is a measurement which would allow us to see why things change or why things do not change, and what is the impact of our intervention. And my model is more or less this. It is not an original model. It is connects with the public opportunity theory in crime of Gary Becker and other people. Only I make this argument at a macro level. And I argue that corruption at national level, it's a balance between opportunities for corrupt behavior. And in policy, it is far easier to manipulate and reduce these opportunities, and constraints to corrupt behavior. Constraints can be legal, like judicial independence of a country and the legal equipment that it has, but also normative, what the society can do, the voters in the society and the civil society. And this, of course, is very development dependent. So I look, on the integrity index on corruption risk org, and it's absolutely sad to see countries which were achievers a few years ago, Burkina Faso, which was going very well, and to understand how, and now it's not, how difficult it is for these countries to have sustainable, good evolution when the number of citizens there, which who have some sort of empowerment, economic and internet empowerment, because this matters a lot, it's so terribly small. But in the same time, I am a bit optimistic for other regions of the world, because if it's something which has been going up a lot in the past 15 years, this is basically what we call digital citizenship, enlightened citizenship. People armed with a good internet household connection and with a smart mobile phone. And of course, in recent years, we have started to think of these people as trolls, but they're not trolls. Most of them are actually not trolls, because we still have a very, very strong powerful association between quality of governance and the number of internet household connections and internet literacy by country. So for most people, it's really positive to be able to use online government services, to do e-petitions, and to simply defend themselves from abuse in an internet way. Okay, I use this model also to explain why we didn't manage internationally, despite increasing the number of constraints through all this legislation, to work. You see here two cases, the global world and the Europe world, but the Europe world is not so different from the global world. It's basically the same thing, in which constraints are this international conventions, sanctions, number of other things which were introduced. In Europe, a lot more than in the international level. We have our own money laundering conventions and things which are supposed to dry up these opportunities, but you also see that opportunities are very high in our world. Simply investing abroad, all this quantity of foreign aid floating around, it's like on top of mineral resources, which are known to be a resource course, all this unaccountable money in Europe, all the PNRR and everything that we do in Europe and in the world have created new opportunities for corruption. And the reason we have not succeeded, despite our good creation of instruments, is that simply constraints continue to be lower than opportunities created by globalization. And the reason for this, of course, is that historically, control of corruption is an equilibrium which closed within national borders. So what I showed you before, this is within national borders, right? What I said before, the number of clients in a country versus the number of citizens, the critical mass in favor of merit-based capitalism versus people who are disclosed at the national level. Countries have their periods, their decades sometimes, when they manage to turn the page and to build this equilibrium. And this, of course, doesn't exist across borders. Across borders, not only jurisdictions are blurred, but there was a reason why in Italian city-states you had to declare yourself until nightfall if you were a visitor. The good governance was very well achieved by knowing where everybody was and who everybody was. You need to have everybody accounted for in a constituency. In Florence, a splendidly governed place in 14th century, you could have been killed with impunity if you have not declared yourself and whom in the city was responsible for you as an external visitor by nightfall. because the way of keeping the equilibrium in the city was to have everyone put in a box, know where everybody is, who accounts for it, how should everybody behave, and the rest of it. Okay. So at the end of this decade, we see that we invested a lot in so-called anti-corruption for development, based on the idea that the more we spend, the more we empower economic growth. And we are very happy that Acemoglu and Robinson finally got a Nobel Prize for making this theory of extractive institutions. But now nobody cares for this anymore, because in the past 1 year, 1.5 years, what really has become important is the fact that certain corrupt countries, which are just a minority of all the corrupt countries out there, also are authoritarian countries and invade other countries like Russia. Okay, so we are moving from this paradigm of anti-corruption for development to a paradigm of anti-corruption for security. So the new Cold War, which is not actually cold at all, is fought in largely about corruption, or on the pretext of corruption, I would say. And I would like to end just by showing a little bit the tools that we created. What I think we have done useful, because there is no other way. You cannot go in every country. You cannot fight with every irrational project. Most of anti-corruption that I know is completely irrational. So there's been years now since I do not accept to do absolutely any consultancy. I just speak in strategic places where I meet all the donors into one place, or their advisor and whatever, but people anyway know me. So there's nothing new that I can tell them. So what I try to offer for them is to offer instruments. And the number one actionable instrument that I created is the so-called T-index, the transparency index, which looks across the world in a new form. In other words, in a transparent form. You see here where it says the de facto components, that you see an index which not only the index rates if something indispensable for anti-corruption exists, like if land cadastre is online, or like register of commerce is online, but where it is, you can actually go in it directly, because all these are hyperlinks. And since this measurement started, we heard from more than 50 governments who wanted to improve their performance, because everything is out there, and because you have this green button where you can send feedback. So governments which want to have a better score on this, and you see on the left the gap between de jure and de facto, and you see that poor countries in Africa, for instance, they adopted quite a lot. But if you look at the gray line, that is the de jure index, conventions and treaties you have signed, but underneath in red is the de facto index, what you actually have out there, which will help citizens, lawyers, businesses who lose public procurement bids to fight against this. So honestly, I think that the future is this. It's for this kind of grassroots anti-corruption, which can work in countries where there is no political will. And this means still a large majority of countries. So countries where corruption is norm, and where political will is very low, because corruption as it is now, it's in the best interest of people who govern these countries. So, going to them with advice is really not very profitable, except for those who give the advice and are paid by day. And what we can do is, however, this kind of tools to empower anyone else, to empower eventual coalitions against them, which I think are the solution. Here are the tools a little bit more closely. These are just tools inspired. These are just tools drawing on United Nations Convention Against Corruption and Sustainable Development Goal 16. But also I think that they are, of course, a lot more things you can do and be transparent, but these are really indispensable. And if you have this, these are really like the necessary and sufficient tools. If countries would just have all this, it would really be fantastic. Societies would be able to defend themselves from their predatory rulers, and we, the internationals, would be far less needed, which from my point of view is what I aim for. I aim to see the situation when it's domestic coalitions, such as mine in 2004, do their job, and the job doesn't come out from an embassy, or doesn't come out from a donor, because those never prove effective and never prove sustainable. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Alina. That was super interesting and a great presentation of your work. Since this might be your last book on corruption, we're very happy to have heard from you today. We'll now turn to our expert discussant, Brigitte Unger, for her thoughts and reflections. And I'd like to remind the audience today that we will have a Q&A towards the end. So I invite you to send your questions. There is a Q&A box at the bottom. So yeah, feel free to write that there. So if that works for you, Brigitte, I will hand over to you now.
Okay. Well, thanks for inviting me. While Professor Mungiu-Pippidi is rethinking corruption, and I would call her the grande dame of corruption research, I had to actually start thinking about corruption because I come from money laundering, having done research the last 30 years on it, and from economics. And for me, corruption was just a simple thing. It entered in 2001 as a predicate crime for money laundering, and it was nicely covered. That there was a parallel scene happening. And therefore, I'm like the students of Professor Mungiu-Pippidi, that I didn't know what UNCAG was, is, so to speak, surprising now, but I didn't know it before we started this project. So there's a whole development in trade and corruption literature which escaped my attention. For me, the book was therefore double highlighting and enlightening. And the major messages for me are what Professor Mungiu-Pippidi mentioned, the paradigm shift from thin to thick corruption. For me, it was also eye-catching that populists like Donald Trump, who could win these elections, basically did the same as the anti-corruption people. Namely, he promised to do away with a corrupt elite, with kleptocrats. He would, so to speak, clean up the thing. And that, so to speak, populists and anti-corruption people share the same goal. And that explains maybe somehow also successes which surprise us very much in Europe, which happened in America. A third thing which I found interesting is that globalization does not reduce corruption. And that reminds me very much of the economic debate on le doux commerce of enlightenment, the soft trade, where we also had predicted that as soon as men can trade, they will lay down their weapons and there will be peace because they can trade and there will be a peaceful world. So the idea was always we've been an anti-corrupt, peaceful world. And I think both directions have completely underestimated human greed, which seems to be, so to speak, indefinitely big. For me, as a money laundering expert, clearly important was to mention the cross-border dimension of corruption. And therefore, the links between corruption, money laundering, tax evasion, and avoidance are interesting, and I think they have been understudied in research. If we look at Europol just last year, we have been drawing about these links. You have on the right hand down below serious and organized crime. That can be drugs, but that can also be corruption, human trafficking or whatever. And organized crime, if it's in big amounts, has to launder these proceeds so that they appear legal. Otherwise, they might be caught. And so when this organized crime tries to launder money, it very often uses corruption in order to finally reach the last stage of money laundering, namely criminal finances and investments, because you want to park the money safely at the end, either in a bank or in a hotel or in something, in a car, in something where it cannot be disguised anymore and recognized as criminal money. For me, so to speak, the challenge was here, how do these three fields which we study, corruption, money laundering, and lately also tax avoidance, fit into each other? Because as Professor Mungiu-Pippidi also wrote in her book, we get in a much more intense phase at the moment. I have therefore shown you a blue phase where things happened, but not very intensely and not much happened. But we come now into a hot, burning red phase where tax evasion, money laundering, and corruption fight, so to speak, can reinforce each other. If we look how corruption started, it was in all three cases, we can see that behind all these regulations is a clear US interest. With corruption, the initiator, the trigger was the Watergate scandal, as Professor Mungiu-Pippidi writes in her book and shows, which basically initiated because Watergate, they found that American firms bribed foreign firms and vice versa, and this could influence US elections. With Money Laundering Control Act, it was that the US, especially under the Reagan regime, found that after 40 years of fighting or 60 years of fighting drug dealers, they couldn't catch them, and they decided, now let's follow the money if we cannot get the drug dealers. And with tax evasion, it was the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, where America saw its profits of corporations and people disappear in Europe and somewhere else, and it wanted to collect the tax money, and therefore said we need automatic exchange of information, and we need, so to speak, better rules for companies, that American money stays in America. So all three fields, the triggers were US national interests, but since it's a cross-border issue in all three domains, America needed allies. And you can see that with corruption, it was the OECD. Also with money laundering originally, but it was a Financial Action Task Force, an inter-organizational group, which was founded in 1989, but also located in the OECD premises. And with tax evasion, it was again the OECD who first had a harmful tax practices report, which was completely ridiculous. It's not on the sheet in 2000, but it only listed small islands, so it was really, it failed. But now it's picked up with automatic exchange of information, with base erosion, profit shifting, and now with the two-pillar model that big companies have to pay at least 15% of their revenue if they have them more than 750 millions in a country, so they cannot just shift their profits to the low or zero tax havens. So there was basically a development which goes very much in line, but timely. Clearly, corruption was first, then came money laundering. And then the important point where I come in, 2001, when corruption became a predicate crime in Europe. So after drugs, also corruption was included as a part of money laundering. What Europe does here, it's abbreviated here as AMLD, Anti-Money Laundering Directives. It basically only follows what the Financial Action Task Force issues at 40 recommendations, each one that they recommend. Europe, a couple of years later, so to speak, implements this into a directive. So first it was drugs, then came corruption in, and then was a big change, because after September 11, the Financial Action Task Force immediately issued 9 additional recommendations to fight terrorism finance. And the EU in 2005 also took this into the 3rd Anti-Money Laundering Directive. This was the one which I studied most, because here we did the only research, I think, where we compared law in the books with law in practice. We traveled to all 27 EU member states and looked what do they have in their books and what do they really do, by interviewing financial intelligence units, enforcement, public prosecutors, people from ministries who had written the laws, to really find out the differences. But that's a lot of work. And it took us 3 years and 3 PhDs. So I can understand that law in practice is not studied so often, because it really takes a lot of time. Well, with the 4th anti-money laundering the directive, suddenly tax crime was accentuated. And then basically it was more on creating transparency. And at the moment, we are in a situation where the EU tries really to centralize money laundering by making, instead of directives, a single rule book, one rule for whole Europe, by creating an AMLA, the Anti-Money Laundering Authority, centrally to supervise all financial intelligence units, and so to speak, to create a centralized and to have one harmonized money laundering definition. That's, by the way, something which I'm terribly missing in the corruption literature, that we don't have a clear definition what it really is. What was very important for this whole process to keep going and to become hot red instead of blue was what I've written here below, civil society. It was Transparency International, which was created, and 2 years after its creation published the first Corruption Perception Index. It was Tax Justice Network, which after 2000 was created and published the Tax Justice Network Financial Secrecy Index. And then all kinds of leaks, which helped to demonstrate there was a world of kleptocrats really going around. It started with LuxLeaks in 2014, where PricewaterhouseCoopers files got hacked and showed that Luxembourg gave preferential tax treatments to really thousands of multinational companies in Luxembourg. We had mentioned the whistleblowers, sad story here. Nobody got convicted for LuxLeaks, only the two whistleblowers, of which one had now basically got under the whistleblower protection, the other one got convicted. So it's a sad story what happens to the whistleblowers, not only in Eastern Europe, but also in Luxembourg. The important leaks were, so to speak, not only were done also by ICIJ, the investigative consortium of the international consortium of investigative journalists, and here there were 14 leaks in total, but 3 were the most prominent one, which made it also a lot in the newspapers. One were the Panama Papers, which were especially important also for money laundering, because that was the hacking of the law firm Mossack Fonseca in Panama, displaying 216,000 files. And very embarrassing one of them, who was disguised, was the head of the Financial Action Task Force in the UK, David Lewis, who had resigned then. Then there was the Paradise Papers, with the Bermuda firm Appleby, which showed a lot of tax evasion files, and then the Pandora Papers with ICIJ also discovered, with also a lot of famous people showing that this was really a systemic abuse of the tax system, of corruption, of money laundering. There were also in between the Luanda leaks, where the daughter of the Angolan president, who was one of the most famous business women in the world, was basically caught, and we found millions of euros going through the Netherlands somewhere. So things got caught. And in this sense, so to speak, I think these regulations have some long-term effect, namely at least that the legal system is set up. Whether something happens or not has to do a lot with activities outside the legal system. So when we rethink now ways to regulate and combat corruption, then we can clearly see that UNCAC, which basically at the moment again evaluates all the laws of these 144 members, or half of them, by now UNCAC has almost 191 countries, like the Financial Action Task Force, but clearly countries must somehow adhere to these two organizations, because if you want to have trade benefits and aid benefits, you must be member of UNCAC. If you want to avoid sanctions of having being on a blacklist of the Financial Action Task Force, which would mean that no US bank would do business with you, you couldn't basically deal in the dollar room, then clearly you want also to sign up. So all countries have an incentive to basically have their books in order, but clearly that doesn't tell us what is law in practice. And that's what Professor Mungiu-Pippidi also mentioned. This law in the books can be a very empty shell. There were high fines. I mean, if we look for Goldman & Sachs, what Alina Mungiu-Pippidi showed, with 3.3 billion of fines for bribing and corruption, we can say it's a lot of money, but the question is, how much is this for Goldman & Sachs? They have a turnover of trillions. They have net earnings of 46 billion in 1 year. So that would make less than 10% of the net earnings of 1 year for having bribed for many years. But still, it's a substantial size. With money laundering, we also have fines, but not for laundering, but for not reporting correctly. So banks get fined. ING Bank had to pay 750 million euros for not reporting a very important suspicious money laundering transaction. We have very little convictions for money laundering, and also very little convictions for corruption. It's very difficult for the legal system to finally get at corrupt money laundering people. One suggestion of Tax Justice Network was that the CEOs should be threatened to have to go to jail for the companies rather than just giving money fines. That's one thing, but which maybe might have an effect. I don't know. We have next to regulations and punishing, you have also action in practice. Europol just says we just confiscate. We take the money and then we look how much it is. But also this was basically a very mild outcome. For 24 EU member states, only 2.1 billion euros got confiscated. It was money, bank accounts, and cars, but at least something. I believe that transparency tools, which are in the uprise now in the money laundering debate, will have some success. We have ultimate beneficial ownership registers, which countries have to set up so that you can find out who is the owner of the company, who owns another company, who is the owner there, who is the final owner of all these company chains. Clearly, we still have a lot of problems to solve, but it's the first way of trying to get a view on who owns what finally. Maybe in 10 years or in 20 years, we are at this point that we can really look into these registers. A second one is the central bank account registers. Account is missing here because central banks register other banks, but central bank account registers, which would mean you have a register where all banking transfers of a country are registered centrally, and the police can have a look so that you can find out which money has been going through your country, independent of which bank it was. I think these are important steps. And I also think automatic exchange of information, which the Americans pushed through, is an important thing because it means that every bank has to inform its country, and the country then informs the other country about bank accounts which are held by foreigners. So if an American holds a bank account in the Netherlands, the Dutch have to inform the US how much money and who holds a bank account there. And Europe does now a similar thing, that you inform each other about foreign bank accounts in your country. Still, I think the really big push was civil society, as Professor Mungiu-Pippidi calls them, the enablers, Transparency International, Tax Justice Network, ICIJ, and the many leaks. And clearly the judicial effects were very poor. Nobody has been punished for the Panama Papers, convicted. But the naming and shaming might be useful. As we saw, the head of the FATF had to resign. The Queen of England came into problems. The president of Iceland had to resign. I mean, there are some individual effects, but clearly they won't take away the whole kleptocracy. So the question we have is it preventive tools like reporting and punishing for not correctly reporting? Is it transparency tools, or is it leaks, which are more promising than repressive tools like convicting somebody into jail? So my three questions to Professor Alina Mungiu-Pippidi. First, to the researcher of political science. Which tools do you think are the most promising to combat corruption? You partly answered it today already, but I ask again. Second one, to the combatant of corruption. If we enter a world where naming and shaming makes a country even more attractive for corruption, what does it mean to combat corruption? And my third one is to the leader of our EU Bridge Gap project on corruption, which is started a year ago. Bridge Gap wants to stimulate the potential usage of modern technology to detect corruption. What do you think can be the role of artificial intelligence in preventing and fighting corruption? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Brigitte. It was great to hear your insights and your expertise as well on money laundering and tax evasion or avoidance in that. Alina, I don't know if you wanted to respond to those reflections, if you wish, for a few minutes, and then we will turn to the Q&A.
Shall I leave or shall I stop?
Okay.
Alina?
Right.
Yes.
I'm already on chat if people want to gain time, because I don't know how much time we still have. So I'm on chat. If people want to ask questions on chat, I'm looking at it. So briefly, I mean, again, I feel first, thank you very much for the splendid presentation for Professor Unger. Very interesting. In particular, the overlap between these areas, corruption and money laundering, the illusions and the rest. I can say that I feel very old today, because even this, you know, what is the contribution of political science and what tools are? I have written and published in different and different papers. You know, I have a paper with Ramin Dadaso, which is called When Anti-Corruption Laws Work, where we make the overall argument that the most corrupt countries have the most laws. But this doesn't matter, that we cannot study context empowering various tools. And this paper is still as when we have written it, because it's a relatively recent paper. So everything is really there. It's called When Anti-Corruption Laws Work. Go ahead and read my paper with Ramin Dadasov. It has a list of all the papers and explains apparent paradoxes. Why, for instance, if increasing restrictions to political funding, corruption grows instead of going down as you would expect, and what you should do, and in what combination, right? Like, you have judicial independence, you don't have judicial independence. Everything is, as I argued, everything is a matter of context in the end of the day. A second, I think Tina Soreire and Mark Peace just published the Elgar Encyclopedia of Law and Corruption last year. And I have an entry which is called The Contribution of Political Science to Corruption Studies. And I considered it, to be honest, a privilege, although it's a short paper. I didn't have time for more, because for lawyers to invite a political science and consider that political science at all have any contribution on corruption, and this was before the Nobel Prize went to Acevoglu and Robinson, was really a big thing. So I think that what we contribute to the fact is that basically corruption should not be thought of. If corruption is a policy problem, as Bridged, for instance, this new research project where I'm jointly with Professor Unger and lots of other fine scholars, is looking at corruption as a policy problem. And I think this is our contribution compared to lawyers. You know, we don't think of individual terms, we don't think of tools or of behavioral nudges which should influence one individual, because the major contribution of political science is actually to argue that it is context which is important, the normative context, which generally is at national level, but it can also be, you know, at organization level, at sector level. Only I think that what my work proves, and the work of other people, Gechter and Schulz, I mean, people who work as experimentalists on totally different plan, proves that it is, you know, over 80% it is national context. Now, I'm not going to tell you that people are doomed by their national context, because I am a person who changed her national context by managing to create a coalition. All right. So I strongly believe that there are historical opportunities when you can turn the page. And in my book with Michael Johnson, Transitions to Good Governance, I gave example of the fact that countries which succeeded, like Uruguay, are people who already were prepared when the window of opportunity came, because you cannot really influence windows of opportunities. Like democratization, EU accession, these are things which do not depend on your will. But what depends on your will is to really be ready when this happens, to know what you do. A lot of people, a lot of elites are totally surprised when it happens to them, and then it lasts only a few years, you know, and it's gone. The reform-minded people we had in Armenia a few years ago, when we featured Armenia as a progress country, it's gone already, you know, or in Georgia, it's now past. So more or less, tools depend on the context, and we have created, you know, for this very thorough research on artificial intelligence, because I want to work with this. I mean, these are the kind of research that we do. I argue that you need things to operate on both sides. You need, on the side of government, to have more and more digital government, in particular internet-based transparency, like the T-index you showed. So we have evidence that the more government services are offered online, the more you control corruption. But also we have evidence that they don't work in themselves unless you have a very active civil society, empowered with the smartphones and fairly activistic. You know, I have been to court against government in my country tens of times. The freedom of information tool in Romania that people use to address requests still sends requests in my name, because we won so many litigations that it's more impressive if somebody from the government receives a freedom of information request signed by me. And then we follow it up through an app. It's nothing it's done by us. I mean, we created an app, but the app came at the end of a decade of strategic litigations. So you need a very active civil society and digitally empowered, and put on both sides. And we have all these interactions, you know, for economists. We have interactions which actually show that what matters is freedom of information and civil society activists in the favor of information, you know, both things. But I think that the digitalization offers fantastic perspectives, and what is missing, what continues to miss, I mean, in public procurement, it's mostly artificial intelligence these days. I mean, the tools that I sell to countries, that my former student Mihaly Fazekas promotes, that we already have in Prozor, or simply allow that automats calculate risks by tender. What we need is the other side. We need that the government empower very simple public management tools, so that public contracting executives who have a lot of high-risk public procurements are replaced, are fired, are replaced. We don't need to put them in jail. It's too expensive. Nobody should be there who organizes, favoritism through public contracts. And you can, using artificial intelligence, you can see what happens in every moment. You can contract you can put it on the authority level. I mean, I recommended in Albania that they publish it by cities. And in Prozoro, before the war, when it worked, the Ukrainian system, I used to sit in my Berlin office and look across Ukrainian municipalities and see who was more corrupt today compared to yesterday. But poor Ukrainians complain that they can also see that, but nothing happens. Okay, nothing happens, because what was missing was a government to act upon it and to basically put in the contracts of all the public managers, saying you are going to have this job for just 1 year, and the main indicator for you is value for money and the risk indicators in your public contracts. There it is, plus whatever other specific goals you had, wherever you are. If you don't use, if you don't have a government, then none of these tools work very well. You have to have a justice. I went to the judiciary many times because for me, the judiciary worked. I would be in jail with the anti-corruption campaigns that I've led, unless the judiciary in Romania were independent, but they were. Okay, I mean, sometimes it was not obvious. It took me years because it was not just me who sued the government. This came later. First, there were very powerful people in government who sued me for libel for the 2004 Coalition for Clean Parliament, for instance. And I never lost in any instance. We did things very professionally, but also it's really the merit of judges, In other countries, we will have ended in jail. There is a Korean professor from Stanford who did a similar campaign in South Korea. He was for 2 years in jail. Although South Korea was, better than other Asian countries, but not good enough, not to be too risky to do such things. So yes, artificial intelligence is splendid, offers some things, but they're not fully self-reinforcement things. They also have to be connected with action on the government side.
Well, thank you both. Thank you both for your incredible presentation today. We are a little bit over time, but I'm very keen that we answer some of these great questions we have. You'll both see the Q&A box at the bottom there, but I will read them and we'll see what we can get through in the time that we have. So first of all, we have a question here.
I see it.
Yes?
I opened it up. Okay.
Oh,
I'm going to go very fast because okay. So first, the sector approach. Well, what I think you can do with a sector approach is that you can do better analysis. So if you take this opportunities versus constraints model, you can definitely build one by sector, but then the situation and the idea that the sectors are somehow decoupled from the national context is wrong for most sectors. There are sectors which are fully into the national sector, and therefore they cannot presume that you are going to be able to reform, let's say, public health, unless you reform the entire country. Most state-owned enterprises, utilities, all these are deeply into the countries. Maybe in shipping or other things which depend more on cross-border, you can have a model of a cross-border model where you can actually have a little bit more influence of international factors. But otherwise, like this, the same limitations apply. Equality is it's not just a treatment, I mean, ethical universalist refers mostly to treatment. So yes, it is equal access, it is equal treatment, but equality is equal opportunity, as is discussed in political science. It's actually more than just ethical universalism. It is in essence the same value, but it is something far more demanding public policy wise. In fact, it's something really expensive, if anybody would, because it means political equality, in fact, means that you are able to correct original institutional endowments if you have a difference. So if you are to really create political equality in a country, for instance, you have to give scholarships for everybody who cannot afford to go to an expensive university. And ethical universalism is, I think, a bit less than that, but I think it's significantly very tall order. International organizations, I really recommend my book, Europe's Burden. from Cambridge University Press, where I look at everything that EU have done, and fairly critically, into 127 countries and the influence of international organizations. My short advice is that international organizations should not contribute to corruption. So they should police themselves, they should police their aid. They're more transparent now than when I started, so I think it is progress here. But still, there are donors who do not publish their donations, famous donors, American donors, who don't publish, for instance, not even their anti-corruption projects, they're not published. And in order to learn something, they should transparently publish all the projects, all the values of projects, where they went, and their success indicators. The anti-corruption package, well, we will talk a lot more about this. Let's see if EU member states agree to uniformize legislation against corruption. That is something which will go against interests of many governments. Of course, it's a lot of shaming involved. People will be reluctant to be seen as the ones which oppose this. I think this is long overdue, so I definitely support the idea of having similar criminal penalties for corruption and similar sanctions across the entire Europe, but the directive doesn't contain only this. As usual, it contains a lot of other things which are less realistic, because by now we have an anti-corruption populism in Europe. So whatever we do, there are people who are going to pop up and ask us to do not rational things, which we have tried before and we know they don't work. But let's see what happens. It's going to be really a wonderful opportunity to see who in Europe is eager to give an example, and who in Europe would rather prefer that things go as they were.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Alina. That was a speedy work through the Q&A, so thank you. And well, thank you everyone that came today. It's super interesting. We will be uploading this to YouTube in the coming days, and we'll make sure that in the description there's links to everything you've heard about today, including the book Rethinking Corruption. And so, well, thank you very much. Brigitte, Alina, it's been wonderful.
Thank you, for organizing this and hosting, and thanks all the participants for joining us today.
Absolutely. You have some emoji claps there coming through from our audience. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Thank you.